Hey guys, tonight we gather in the salted air of a cold Nordic coast, where the horizon stays dim and the wind never quite hushes. You trudge uphill with the others, boots crunching frost, as the crowd ahead clusters around a ring of stones. This is the thing, the great Viking assembly, not a party, not a feast, but somehow still a place people bring both beer and sheep. You're here for justice, or revenge, or maybe just to avoid being declared an outlaw for skipping jury duty. Someone passes by with a sack of smoked fish under one arm and a nervous goat in tow. Another man yells something about land boundaries, while wildly gesturing with a stick that may or may not be a symbolic weapon. You're not entirely sure if you're in a court of law or an aggressive poetry slam, but either way, you're in it now. Oh, and you probably won't survive this. Not because of swordplay, though that's always a possibility, but because keeping up with Viking legal codes could make your brain turn to boiled oats. It's intricate, oral, poetic, and very, very obsessed with sheep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You inch closer to the center, where a man in a thick woolen cloak raises his hand and quiets the crowd with no more than a glance. That's the law speaker. He doesn't carry scrolls or scribble in wax tablets. He carries the entire legal tradition of your people in his head. He opens his mouth and begins to chant, not yell, not drone, chant. Every ruling, every custom, every little fine for stepping on someone's barley field gets recited in a rhythm as old as the stones beneath your feet. The law, you realize, isn't something you read, it's something you remember. And you'll need to, because if you ever end up in dispute and you can't recall the right verse to defend yourself, you're toast covered in fermented herring. You shift your weight as the wind picks up. The man next to you is arguing about a boat that was borrowed and returned with a suspicious crack in the hull. The other guy says it was spirit damage, possibly inflicted by a coastal wight. Historians still argue whether Viking law truly made room for supernatural claims, or whether that was just the medieval version of "my dog ate my homework." Meanwhile, someone else shuffles by, dragging a reluctant sheep. You learn this is no ordinary livestock. It's a unit of currency, a mobile fine, a four-legged apology wrapped in wool. Fines aren't always paid in silver. Often, they're settled in goods, sheep, axes, barrels of salted meat. Justice here is deeply tied to what you can carry through a blizzard. The land around the assembly ground is considered sacred. No weapons drawn, no blood spilled. Well, that's the idea. Occasionally, the sacredness gets ignored, like the infamous Thing Brawl of 907, when a misquoted poem about someone's father ended in a week-long grudge and 3 cracked skulls. But you don't bring that up unless you're sure nobody from the Snorrison clan is nearby. You stand, arms crossed, pretending to understand the complex hierarchy of decisions being made. There are chieftains, law speakers, and a sort of proto-jury made up of local freemen. It's democracy, kind of, if your definition of democracy includes yelling over who stole whose snowshoes and occasionally resolving things with arm wrestling. Then There's the ale, always the ale. It's unclear whether the legal decisions are fueled or fogged by it, probably both. The thing is part courtroom, part community festival, and part highly intoxicated town hall. Somewhere, someone's playing a crude fiddle. Somewhere else, a woman sells hot flatbread while weighing gossip against the wind. You notice a young boy reciting verses by the fire. His father is training him to be a lawman one day. In this world, poetry isn't just an art form, it's a filing system. Instead of laws written in books, they're crafted into stanzas, rhymed and metered for easier memory. Quirky? Definitely. Effective? Mostly. Occasionally dangerous? Also, yes, one misremembered verse, and someone might lose a cow and their honor. You move closer to hear a land dispute being decided. Two neighbors are arguing over a stream that shifted during the spring thaw. The law speaker hears both sides and then recites a rule about natural boundaries and frost rights. The decision? Split the stream, but one man owes the other 3 sheep and a carved spoon. You blink. The spoon is apparently a ceremonial object, or maybe it's just a nice spoon. Historians still argue whether Viking law leaned more toward punitive justice or restoration. What's clear is that the community preferred settling scores with compensation over bloodshed, usually. Still, if someone insulted your lineage or trampled your barley without permission, let's just say your chances of a peaceful resolution went down with the sun. A bell clangs somewhere. Okay, it's actually a shield being whacked with a stick, and the day's sessions wrap up. People start drifting toward campfires, stew pots, and yes, more ale. You're left standing there, wrapped in smoke and sea air, wondering how long it would take you to memorize 400 laws and still remember your cousin's name. And just like that, you're part of it now. The strange, poetic, livestock-laden machinery of Viking law. The firelight crackles low as you settle cross-legged near the storyteller. Except this isn't a tale of dragons or daring sea raids. This is law. Specifically, the man before you is a law speaker, or lagsogumadur, the walking, talking legal mainframe of Viking society. You're not entirely sure whether to respect him or feel bad for him. His job? To memorize the law, all of it, by heart, and recite it, without messing up, even when his nose is running and someone in the crowd is roasting onions too close to the fire. This isn't just a party trick. Viking laws were rarely written down until much later. For centuries, the entire system lived in the minds and mouths of these poet lawyers, passed down in verse. It wasn't because they were too lazy to invent parchment. It was deliberate. Poetry helped people remember rhyme, rhythm, repetition. If you're thinking of Dr. Seuss, but with more sheep finds, you're not far off. You lean in as the law speaker begins to chant. His voice carries over the wind, calm and musical, yet firm. He's not improvising. He's drawing from a mental library that would make a modern lawyer weep. Every legal clause has been shaped to fit an oral tradition, and yes, even the rule about not stealing cheese from a burial feast has a couplet of its own. And that's not just a random example. You overhear an old man whisper to his neighbor, "Remember the cheese case from Torskfjord?" Apparently, someone once snuck off with funeral cheese and tried to argue it was an offering to Thor. It wasn't. It was dairy theft, and it ended with a poetic decree involving restitution, a public apology, and the shame of having your name awkwardly rhymed with rancid. Poets in this world aren't just entertainers, they're legal guardians. Skalds, the court bards of the Norse, often doubled as archivists of justice. Their verses didn't only praise kings or recount battles, they recorded lawsuits, judgments, and disputes, sometimes slipping commentary into sagas that doubled as gossip and warning. You recall the tale of one skald who subtly mocked a chieftain's poor legal decision by composing a verse about a goat who couldn't tell land from sea. The chieftain didn't catch on for weeks. By then, the verse had spread across 3 villages and was being sung at weddings. Historians still argue whether these skalds held true legal authority or were more like satirical watchdogs. But one thing's clear. In a society where laws were fluid, your reputation often mattered more than your guilt, and a good poem could elevate or destroy you faster than any sword. The law speaker pauses for breath and nods toward a young apprentice beside him. The boy takes over seamlessly, reciting a passage about inheritance law. It's a complex matter, especially when multiple children, half-siblings, and random cousins all claim the same field. The verse details who gets what, in what order, and how to deal with someone who refuses to accept their allotted half of a goat. There's humor baked into the phrasing, not because it's funny, though some lines land that way, but because people remember better when they laugh. You can't forget the clause about property lines, stretching from the stone that looks like a chicken to the bush where Bjorn fell asleep drunk. It's oddly specific. It's also legally binding. Someone mutters behind you, "We really need a verse about sheep trampling barley after rain." Apparently, the existing law doesn't cover the scenario precisely enough. That's how new laws are born, through cases, complaints, and the occasional accidental loophole involving livestock. The law speaker returns to a passage about land ownership and seasonal rights. You realize that some laws only apply during certain times of year, like the one about who can graze their sheep in the highlands once the snow melts. The timing matters. So does knowing the poetic calendar tied to it. You try to imagine being in his shoes, memorizing hundreds of verses, each with built-in references to time, place, and exceptions. One misstep and someone might end up losing their winter shelter, or worse, be forced to compose a compensation poem while standing barefoot on frozen moss. And yes, that was a real punishment. One chieftain ordered a man to recite his apology in verse form, while hopping on one foot in front of the village. Supposedly, it restored the balance of honor, or at least provided entertainment during a particularly boring spring thing. You're struck by how flexible yet strict the system is. The words are fixed, the rhythm precise, but interpretation, that's where things get blurry. 2 men can hear the same law and walk away with different ideas about what it means. That's where the law speaker earns his keep, not just in remembering, but in interpreting. He stops again, this time to answer a challenge from a farmer who claims the recited verse doesn't apply in wet seasons. The law speaker blinks once, then recites a counterverse involving rainfall, flooded paths, and something about a cursed duck pond. Everyone nods. The matter is closed. You stretch your legs as a few people shuffle forward to present minor complaints. One woman wants a ruling on whether her neighbor's chickens crossing her yard counts as trespass. The law speaker responds with a quatrain about poultry rights and crop damage. No joke, chickens had legal protections, if not out of kindness, then at least out of a desperate need to keep order in densely packed villages. Meanwhile, the crowd around you debates a completely different issue. Which type of verse is best for remembering dispute settlements? Some swear by alliteration, others prefer internal rhyme. It's like arguing over whether color coding your calendar or using stickers makes you more organized, except your cow's fate hangs in the balance. You realize this system, for all its quirks, works because people believe in it. The verses are shared, sung, taught to children. Law isn't locked away in scrolls. It lives in campfire stories, jokes, lullabies. It surrounds you like mist. As the sky dims into twilight, the law speaker sits back, rubbing his temples. Tomorrow he'll begin again. Another day, another chant, another legal tangle turned into verse. For now, he drinks something hot and sour smelling from a carved horn. You suspect it's fermented turnip. You do not ask to try it. And you, still cross-legged in the dust, begin to hum a line from earlier about a man who owed sheep but tried to pay with fish. You'll remember it, maybe forever. You wake to shouting, nothing violent, just the everyday roar of Viking litigation warming up. Somewhere nearby, someone is loudly declaring that his neighbor's pig is a liar. You blink, stretch, and squint at the frosted landscape, the sun still low and lazy, filtering through smoke and stew steam. Today's disputes are spicier. This morning, they're doing oaths, challenges, and full-on my word against yours showdowns. And here, truth isn't decided by evidence in the way you might expect. Instead, it's about honor, reputation, and how convincingly you can swear an oath without blinking, or preferably while holding a hot iron. Yes, trial by ordeal, the ancient courtroom equivalent of prove you're innocent by surviving this very bad idea. There's a smoldering pit where someone just cooled a piece of metal in snowmelt. A young man stands beside it, shirt half off, face pale. Apparently he's been accused of stealing 2 lambs and 1 cheese wheel, his defense. He will pick up the iron bar with his bare hand, walk 3 steps, and then wait 3 days. If his burns don't blister too much, he's innocent. You shift uncomfortably. Trial by ordeal sounds more like a reality show challenge gone rogue. But here, it's serious business. The community believes the gods, or perhaps fate itself, will intervene on the side of truth. Historians still argue whether people truly trusted this divine justice, or whether it was more of a social pressure cooker designed to test your willingness to suffer for your claim. But there are alternatives. A less painful method is the oath circle. You gather your kin, ideally 12 honorable people, and each of you swears to the truth of your statement. You all place hands on a holy object, usually a Thor's hammer pendant or the hilt of a consecrated sword, and chant an oath in unison. No wiggling fingers, no sweaty palms. Just the solemn boom of 12 voices saying, "He didn't steal the cheese, and may we all be snake-bitten if we lie." Of course, gathering 12 people willing to risk snake bites on your behalf, is no small feat. It's not just a legal maneuver, it's a social test. If no one steps up for you, well, that's its own verdict, isn't it? Then there's the insult off, unofficial but common. If two people accuse each other of lying, and neither wants a trial by fire or frostbite, they can opt to insult each other, publicly, loudly, with poetic flair. The community watches, judges, and often laughs. The first person to falter, say by accidentally rhyming cow with how now brown sow, loses, or at least loses the crowd. You witness one such bout near the stew line. A fisherman and a sheep herder go toe to toe, swapping barbed stanzas about each other's mothers, farming skills, and personal hygiene. It's brutal, it's musical, it's weirdly satisfying. And eventually, the crowd decides the fisherman's reference to fish breath mating with fog is too good to top. Case dismissed. Herder pays a small fine and walks off muttering. It's not always poetic, though. Sometimes, truth comes down to staring. You hear about a chieftain who resolved a minor theft accusation by having the accused and accuser stare at each other in silence for an hour. Whoever blinked first lost. This is known as glara augu, or clear-eyed justice. Is it effective? Probably not. But is it intimidating? Absolutely. There's also arbitration by ale, another unofficial but recognized practice. Two parties agree to share a horn of ale, say nothing, and nod once when they feel the matter is resolved. It's legally binding if witnessed by three sober people. The challenge, of course, is finding three sober people. You sit in on a more formal case now. A farmer claims a neighbor let goats graze on his barley field. There are no witnesses, no hoofprints, no goat confessions, just word against word. The accused steps forward, arms crossed, and offers to take an oath. The thing agrees. He recites an oath so poetic it might qualify for a bard's contest, swearing upon the bones of his grandfather and the beard of Thor. The crowd listens. No one laughs. He finishes, hand on the sacred rock. There's a pause, then a murmured acceptance. The law speaker nods. The case is settled, not necessarily because he's believed, but because no one wants to challenge the oath. That's the Viking legal system, part courtroom, part theater, all deeply dependent on communal belief. You think of modern courts, with their transcripts, their objections, their rows of suited jurors. Here, it's different. Here, a loud enough voice, a clever enough poem, or a hand unblistered by iron can shape your fate. Someone sidles up next to you. He whispers, "Sometimes the guilty win." You nod. You've seen it already. Justice here isn't perfect, but it's public. Everyone watches. Everyone remembers. And that matters. Across the field, someone is throwing up behind a tent. Turns out, trial by ale doesn't mix well with fermented shark. You file that away. Back near the main circle, a new dispute brews. A woman claims her cousin broke a marriage contract by promising 2 goats and delivering only one, and a sickly one at that. The cousin shrugs, then starts composing a defense verse right on the spot. It rhymes goat with remote, which is impressive considering that word didn't exist yet. Everyone looks impressed. You're too tired to argue. Historians still debate how much sway these spoken decisions held across different regions. In some places, Oaths and ordeals were binding. In others, local custom overruled the law speaker. What's clear is that Viking legal culture was intensely performative, less about the cold facts and more about how convincingly you could stand your ground in front of a crowd that included your grandmother and at least one guy who smelled like fish guts. You turn to leave as the sky darkens again. Another day of fire pits, shouted oaths, and poetic battles comes to a close. The verdicts stand for now. But tomorrow, someone will challenge them, or outrhyme them, or show up with a goose and a stronger oath. And you'll be right there, watching, judging, maybe even reciting. Because in this world, law is a performance, and every Viking is born with a front row seat. You hear it before you see it, the buying. Not a gentle pastoral bleat, but the urgent, panicked kind that says, I am not emotionally prepared to be used as legal currency today. A man stumbles into the assembly ring, dragging 2 sheep behind him and shouting about a fence dispute. You take a step back. This is about to get fluffy. Here's the thing. Viking law was deeply obsessed with livestock, and not in a how cute kind of way. Sheep weren't just animals. They were the gold standard of fines, compensation, dowries, and sometimes passive-aggressive apologies. In the absence of coinage in many regions, sheep were currency, status, and occasionally scapegoats. The man at the center of the ring now presents his complaint. His neighbor, he claims, extended his property line by shifting a stone marker, and as a result, his sheep now graze on the wrong side of the boundary. This has caused what he calls moral wool confusion. You stifle a snort. The accused responds by dragging forward his own sheep, healthier, fluffier, possibly smugger, and declares the stones have always been where they are. To settle the matter, both parties agree to invoke the 5 sheep rule. Basically, the loser gives the other 5 sheep as compensation. That's roughly the value of 2 modest houses and a suspiciously large amount of salted herring. The law speaker nods, begins to recite a verse about boundary stones and grazing rights. The poem dates back over a century and contains an alarming number of goat metaphors. But buried in the rhyme is a crucial clause. Any property line dispute involving livestock must include witness testimony from 3 unblooded men of planting age. Translation: 3 teenage boys who've never fought in battle and know how to grow turnips. Historians still argue whether this rule was meant to ensure neutrality or just give bored teenagers something to do. Either way, a trio of lanky lads steps forward, eyes wide, clearly just excited to be involved in adult drama. They examine the stones, confer quietly, and then each swears, very dramatically, that the fence was moved after last winter. Decision made. The sheep shifter loses. He grumbles, hands over 5 woolly creatures, and one of them immediately pees on his foot. Justice, it seems, has a sense of humor. But this isn't the only sheep drama today. You shuffle over to another cluster where someone is being accused of paying a weregild, the price for injury or death, with the wrong kind of sheep. According to the offended party, the sheep were scrawny, moth-chewed, and weirdly aloof. This might sound petty, but in Viking law, the quality of compensation mattered deeply. Paying someone with subpar livestock could be interpreted as a fresh insult. In some regions, There were even rules specifying that sheep used for legal fines had to be of middle age, sound of hoof, with fleece not matted and eyes alert. You're not making this up. One saga tells of a man who accepted a sheep fine, only to realize later that all three had mange. He sued, won, and was awarded a replacement sheep plus a goat of musical temperament, which might be a mistranslation, but sounds amazing. Then there's the dead sheep loophole. You hear about this from a woman who claims her husband paid a debt with two sheep that looked alive, but were, in fact, cleverly frozen and propped up. By the time she got them home, they'd thawed into corpses. She filed a complaint under the fraudulent livestock exchange clause, which definitely exists, and demanded triple restitution and public shaming. This was resolved with the rare but spectacular sheep walk of shame, where the guilty party had to parade through the village wearing a wreath of nettles while leading the defrosted sheep corpses on a cart. Poetic justice? Absolutely. Effective? Who knows? You wonder what it was like to live in a world where your legal credibility hinged on how woolly your offerings were. If you showed up with clean, plump, well-behaved sheep, you were clearly a decent, upstanding person. If your sheep limped, drooled, or looked embarrassed, your case suffered. It wasn't just fines. Marriages involved sheep, land purchases, sheep, religious offerings, definitely sheep. One surviving fragment of Viking law even describes a marriage arrangement where the bride's family demanded 12 fine ewes, one horned ram, and a wool cloak dyed blue as proof of the groom's financial and moral fitness. Romantic? No. Sheep were so integral to the legal system that disputes over them got their own subcategory in some law codes. You overhear one old-timer explain that in his village, sheep trials were held separately from regular legal matters to avoid bias, distractions, and wool-based shouting. Still, not all sheep-related cases were straightforward. You come across a man trying to pay a debt with a poem about a sheep instead of an actual animal. He claims the verse captures the spirit and dignity of livestock. The judge listens, amused, and says that unless the poem can produce wool or bleat convincingly, it won't count. Case dismissed. There's also the matter of symbolic sheep, those used not as real payments, but as ritual stand-ins for apology. In rare cases, a hand-carved wooden sheep could be presented, usually along with a poem and some tears, to resolve an emotional grievance. Historians debate whether this was ever legally binding, or just a very elaborate form of saying, "I'm sorry I burned your haystack." As the day wears on, you start to notice the rhythm of it all, the chant of law songs, the clatter of hooves, the occasional fart from an impatient ram. It's oddly soothing. You watch a young boy practice sheep valuation under his grandfather's eye, checking hooves, measuring wool, sniffing for health. Legal training, Viking style. You also hear whispers of sheep-based bribery, not common, but not unheard of. "You want a favorable ruling?" a man says, glancing both ways. "Maybe don't bring just sheep, bring stew too." As twilight rolls in and the sheep are herded back to their respective owners, those that weren't legally reassigned, that is, you marvel at the fact that this entire society runs in part on the back of bleeding, slightly damp wool monsters, and you make a note to never, ever pay for anything with a frozen sheep. Evening descends, and with it comes the kind of cold that wraps around your ankles and climbs like it's looking for a soft spot to settle in. You're still at the thing, huddled near a low fire, listening as an elder tells a tale that's not quite a story and not quite a warning. It's about blood feuds and how Viking society worked really, really hard to stop them from spiraling into full blown, family annihilating disasters. You learn quickly if someone kills your cousin, you don't just charge in swinging. That's not justice, that's an unregistered escalation. Instead, you're supposed to bring your complaint to the thing, explain the situation calmly, and ideally work out a settlement. Usually in livestock, land, or goods, sometimes in verse, occasionally with a handshake over salted fish. This system was called weregild, literally man price. Every person had a value based on social status. If you killed someone, you were expected to pay their family that amount. It wasn't cheap, and it wasn't optional unless you wanted your name recited bitterly for the next 100 winters. Of course, this only worked if people accepted the payment, and that's where things got complicated. Some families, especially the grudge-prone ones, refused weregild. They wanted vengeance, not sheep. So instead of peace, you got a blood feud, a back and forth of revenge killings, sabotage, and really awkward feast invitations. Historians still argue whether Viking society genuinely preferred peaceful resolution or just created elaborate systems to look peaceful while quietly sharpening their axes. You hear about one infamous case from the East Fjords where two cousins fought over a fishing cove. One insulted the other's boat craftsmanship, then things escalated until goats were poisoned, roofs were burned, and someone's cow mysteriously turned up wearing shoes. After 3 years of low-key warfare, they agreed to settle with an exchange of 5 barrels of herring and a public poem recited by both parties while standing ankle-deep in cold water. The poem ended with the line, "Let the sea forget our fury." It didn't rhyme, but it did the trick. You glance around and see a group of men debating a recent fight that nearly turned into a feud. A merchant's son had accidentally struck a farmer during a drunken feast. No serious injury, but pride was wounded and someone's beard got singed. Rather than seek revenge, the farmer composed a mildly humiliating song about the incident and made the merchant's son perform it in public. Feud avoided, ego bruised, legal success. It wasn't always that tidy. One woman you speak to, sharp-eyed and wrapped in a sealskin cloak, remembers her grandfather getting into a years-long feud over stolen fishing nets. It began with one missing net and ended with 2 barns burned and a goat that refused to come home ever again. Her takeaway? Sometimes it's cheaper to let things go, or at least to let someone else sing about it first. The thing tried to keep feuds contained. There were rules, strict ones, about when revenge could be taken. You couldn't just ambush someone in the middle of the night. There were guidelines. You had to declare your intent, give the other family time to respond, and ideally wait until after the harvest. Civilized bloodshed. You also couldn't kill someone in certain places, like a church or the sacred space of the thing itself. Doing so made you an outlaw, stripped of protection, left to wander the wilds. More on that lovely status later. But sometimes, revenge didn't involve violence. it involved art. One saga tells of a man who, instead of stabbing his enemy, composed a 42-verse insult poem about him, describing his lackluster beard, his cowardly chickens, and his suspiciously small drinking horn. The poem was so devastating that the target fled the village. No blood spilled, but honor was restored, or at least shifted. You think about modern conflict resolution, therapy, mediation, maybe a strongly worded email. Here, people settled grudges with livestock exchanges, public humiliation, or cold, careful verses that hit where it hurt most, the ego. Sometimes, though, the thing itself would intervene to stop a feud before it began. You watch as a pair of young men are brought before the council, cousins from rival families, both clearly spoiling for a fight. The law speaker doesn't lecture. Instead, he invites them to a shared stew pot, recites a verse about the wisdom of geese, and declares that any future quarrel between them must be settled via wrestling in the snow while blindfolded. The crowd loves it. The cousins, caught between pride and hilarity, agree. Feud averted, at least for now. Not everyone was lucky. Some families became infamous for their grudge holding. You overhear someone say, "Marry a Bjorn's daughter if you want drama." Another man adds, "Their cows won't even graze near our fields." These old wounds rarely healed cleanly. Even generations later, a long-dead feud could bubble up if someone mentioned the wrong grandfather or mispronounced a family poem. One particularly spicy story involves a woman who refused a weregild offer after her brother was killed. Not because it wasn't fair, it was generous, actually, but because she didn't like the sheep. She called them patchy, rude, and spiritually hollow. Instead of accepting, she moved 3 villages away and raised her children on stories of betrayal and bad wool. Her great-granddaughter later poisoned the family stew of her brother's killer's descendants. Over a century of tension, all because of ugly sheep. You can't help but admire how Viking law tried to channel vengeance into structure. Where other societies might just have endless bloodshed, this one said, "Sure, fight, but do it in rhyme, with witnesses, and possibly over stew." You're pulled from your thoughts by a distant voice calling for stew and calm. A nearby argument fizzles as both parties agree to talk it out over soup. One of them adds, "No fish heads this time." You're not sure if that's a condition or a threat. As the fire crackles low, someone nearby hums a familiar line, "To spill no blood, let rage be sung." It's a common refrain in those parts. You hum along quietly. The wind picks up again, carrying with it a scent that's hard to place. Wood smoke, salt, maybe regret. You shuffle closer to the fire, but your eyes are fixed on the man sitting alone just beyond the light. His cloak is threadbare. His boots are more holes than leather, and no one will look directly at him. He's an outlaw. Now, if that word conjures images of roguish charm and thrilling horseback chases, disabuse yourself immediately. In Viking law, becoming an outlaw didn't make you cool. It made you invisible. Officially, it meant being placed utlegdiar, or outside the law. You weren't just kicked out of society. You lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill you, rob you, or refuse you stew, and no one would raise an eyebrow. You might be declared outlaw for serious crimes like murder, arson, or violating thing space with weapons. But just as often, you could find yourself on the outside for breaking an oath, skipping your trial, or, get this, repeatedly refusing to settle a sheep fine. Yes, the wrong attitude about mutton could get you banished to the frozen hills. There were two main types of outlawry: Fjorbagsgarder, temporary exile, usually 3 years, and Skoganger, or forest going, which was permanent. If you were sentenced to the latter, you were expected to disappear. If you didn't, well, someone might help you along. You hear whispers that the man beyond the fire was once a respected boat builder. He insulted a chieftain during a feast, possibly while drunk, possibly while inventing a new rhyme for barnacle. When he refused to apologize and then failed to show up for his thing trial, the law had no choice. Outlawed, his name scraped from records, his goat confiscated. Outlaws didn't get trials once sentenced. No appeals, no second chances. It was the ultimate social death. You weren't executed, you were erased. Your property was seized, your kin discouraged from helping you, and your house sometimes literally dismantled. In some cases, people marked former outlaw dwellings with carved bones or smeared tar just in case anyone forgot. You hear stories of outlaws who survived. They lived in caves, hunted alone, bartered in secret with sympathetic traders. One even turned his exile into something of a business, offering to remove problems for others, no questions asked. Kind of like a Viking vigilante, except with worse grooming. Historians still debate how strictly outlawry was enforced. Some argue it was more symbolic, a way to strip someone of honor without necessarily killing them. Others suggest communities loved the drama and fully embraced the hunt. Either way, the psychological weight of being unprotected was crushing. You weren't a citizen, you weren't a person, you were a shadow in the trees. Some laws even made room for redemption. A temporary outlaw could return after 3 winters if they hadn't committed more crimes, and if their victims accepted a peace offering. This often involved a public apology, a hefty fine, and in one case, a dramatic reenactment of their crime using wooden dolls and a goose. No, you don't know why the goose was there. Nobody does. You listen as the law speaker describes the formal process of outlawry. The announcement begins with a booming chant, followed by the accused's name, repeated 3 times, each time louder than the last. A final verse is recited, usually something dramatic, like "May frost eat his path and silence follow his name," and then it's done. The community turns away. There's an eerie silence when it happens. No shouting, no drama. Just that moment when everyone quietly agrees that you're not part of their world anymore. You watch a small boy edge toward the outlaw at the edge of camp. He holds out a chunk of bread. His mother snatches him back before contact. The outlaw doesn't even flinch. He just stares into the fire, as if hoping the flames might burn him back into visibility. Some exiles became legends. There's the tale of Grettir the Strong, outlawed for manslaughter, who survived over 19 years in exile, fending off attacks, living in caves, writing poetry about loneliness and moss. He was part hero, part cautionary tale. Another outlaw supposedly trained ravens to deliver messages between fjords. Probably not true, but the image sticks. There are even rumors of outlaw communities, hollowed out valleys, where the banished formed new societies with their own rules, lawless but not lifeless. These rogue villages may never have existed, or they may have been nothing more than old shepherds and smugglers sharing stew in the snow. You ask someone what happens if you kill an outlaw. The answer is matter of fact. You don't get punished. You might get a free cloak. Grim, yes, but it drives the point home. The law didn't just punish wrongdoing, it maintained the illusion of order. Outlaws threatened that. Their erasure was part theater, part necessity. It makes you wonder, how many people watched loved ones become outlaws? Did they sneak bread to them, whisper names into the woods? Or did they stand with the others, eyes fixed forward, pretending they never knew that person's voice? The fire burns low. The outlaw stands, wraps himself tighter in his cloak, and disappears into the dark. No one calls after him. No one watches long, but you do. You watch until he's just a blur, swallowed by wind and frost. And in that moment, you realize Viking justice didn't just shape laws, it shaped memory. If you followed the rules, you became part of the story. If you didn't, the story moved on without you. The sky has turned a grayish blue that promises either snow or more stew, possibly both. You wander back toward the main gathering circle, where a new story is unfolding. This one is darker. There's tension in the air, a nervous hum. A group of elders are debating something serious, the time the law hall burned down. Now, hall might conjure images of grand wooden longhouses with dragon heads on the eaves. In reality, Viking thing sites were usually open-air affairs, rings of stones, cleared fields, occasionally a modest wooden structure or shelter for deliberations. But this law hall was different. Located near a crossroads in western Norway, it had walls, a roof, and even a hearth. It was a symbol, maybe even an experiment in formality. And one night, it went up in flames. You lean in as the old man tells it. It began with an argument. Two families, feuding over river access, came to blows during a long-winded recitation of cattle tax law. Someone threw a drinking horn, someone else threw a stool. Then, depending on which version you believe, a torch fell, or was thrown, or simply walked across the room of its own free will, as one poetic account claims. The hall caught fire, fast. There were people still inside. Some got out. One did not. You feel a chill, despite the fire in front of you. The storyteller lowers his voice. They said it was an accident. He shrugs. Maybe. Historians still argue whether the burning was deliberate, a sudden feud explosion, or a cover-up for something darker. The timing was suspicious, and one of the men who escaped left town the next morning and was never seen again. The loss of the law hall had consequences, not just structurally, but socially. People argued for weeks about where to meet next. Some refused to gather at the burned site, calling it cursed. Others insisted that law must be recited where blood had been spilled to honor the seriousness, as one elder claimed, though you suspect he just liked the drama. You overhear another theory, that the fire was started to destroy a controversial draft law. Supposedly, a new clause had been proposed, restricting fishing rights for those with fewer than 3 nets. Poorer families weren't happy, and some whispered that burning the hall was the only way to keep the rule from being recited and remembered. Viking law was oral, remember? If a law wasn't spoken at the thing, it didn't officially exist. By torching the space before the reading, some believe the rebels wiped the law before it could take hold. It's a fringe theory, sure, but you can't help but admire the dramatic flair. It's basically an ancient version of pulling the fire alarm to avoid a test, only with more consequences and fewer marshmallows. In the aftermath, smaller things popped up nearby: splinter assemblies, rival gatherings. One was even held on a frozen lake, because the chieftain believed law should be slippery if the truth is. That session ended when someone dropped the sacred law staff through a crack in the ice. You really can't make this stuff up. Eventually, they rebuilt a meeting place. Not a hall, but a stone circle lined with carved posts. Simpler, fireproof. Some called it a return to tradition. Others said it was just cheaper. Either way, it lacked the enclosed drama of the burned hall. No walls meant fewer secrets, and probably fewer lawsuits about torches. Still, the event stuck in collective memory. Skalds composed odes about it, with lines like, "Justice burned in timber breath, as truth fled smoke and drunken death." A bit much, but it rhymed. You hear someone hum the melody of one of those poems now. It's slow and grim, perfect for sleep or civil litigation. You also discover that one of the surviving pillars from the original law hall was salvaged and repurposed as a ceremonial post. Everything since then, someone touches it before speaking, a nod to the past, a warning, or just tradition. Doing what it always does, clinging on, smoke-stained and stubborn. A younger man tells you there's still debate over who lit the fire. 3 families have claimed credit, or blame, depending on their pride level. One old woman says her great-grandfather confessed to doing it, but only because the stew was bad and the speeches were long. The truth, like so many things here, is wrapped in ash and pride. You ask what happened to the man who didn't make it out. They pause, then someone recites his name, slowly, as if trying to bring him back through verse. They say he was a minor landowner, not wealthy, but honest. He was trying to resolve a land inheritance dispute when the fire came. His case was never decided. The field in question is still called Half-Claim Meadow, poetic in a grim way. The fire became more than an event. It became a symbol of legal fragility, of the danger of tempers, of how quickly structure can burn. You imagine a world where justice lives in verses and is spoken into being, and then imagine how easy it is to silence a verse, one spark, one flame, one misplaced horn of mead. A child asks if they'll ever rebuild the hall. The answer is soft. No, the law walks with us now. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of your own fire, hearing the whispers of ghost law and flame song. And you wonder how many laws, how many stories, how many judgments have been lost, not to time, but to smoke. Your fingers are still warm from the fire when a shout slices through the dusk. Not anger, not fear, just the exaggerated volume of someone trying to sound more confident than they feel. You follow the sound toward a long table where a feast is underway, and right at the center, standing precariously on a bench, is a man boasting loudly about how many ships he owns. Here we go again. Vikings loved a good boast. It was practically a civic duty. Feasting halls often doubled as arenas of honor, where warriors, traders, and semi successful goat breeders would proclaim their greatness between mouthfuls of stew. But here's the thing: in a society built on reputation, words had legal consequences. That ship boasting fellow, he just claimed to own land that overlaps with another man's field. The other man, currently chewing a roasted turnip, freezes. Slowly he swallows. Then he stands up, wipes his mouth with deliberate care, and says, "Say that again, slower." You step back. This is the moment when a boast turns into a claim, and in Viking law, a public claim, especially made during a thing feast, could spark a legal process whether you meant it or not. Say the wrong thing in front of witnesses, and congratulations, you've just opened a case. The boaster repeats himself, emboldened by the ale and the attention. I own the ridge, the stream, and everything between. The other man replies, funny, that's where I buried my uncle. Boom! We're in legal territory now. The law speaker sighs and starts pulling on his cloak. Looks like tomorrow's docket just got an extra hearing. You learn that this kind of feast boasting has its own section in some legal traditions. Rules for when, where, and how a boast becomes binding. And also what to do if someone lies during one. Spoiler, it involves a verse duel. You wouldn't think false bragging could carry consequences. But in this world, your words aren't just talk. They're a contract, especially if spoken with mead breath in front of 10 or more people. It's called ad rena ord, or to test words. The more formal the setting, the more serious the boast. You move through the feast, catching snippets of other claims. A man says his dog once chased off a bear. Someone counters with a story about their cousin's cat delivering twins. A woman calmly states that her barley beer can raise the dead. There's laughter, sure, but also sharp ears listening for anything that smells like a legal steak. Historians still debate whether these boasts were always taken seriously. Some say they were performative, a kind of masculine theater. Others argue that every word mattered, even in jest, especially in jest. Because if you joked about owning something and no one disputed it and people remembered it, suddenly that joke might be your next court case. You hear of a famous case from the sagas. A young man at a thing feast boasted that he'd inherited every stick of land between the fjords. People laughed, but no one formally challenged it. Years later, he invoked the boast to claim grazing rights, and won. His cousin never forgave him, or fed him at Yule again. Back at the feast, someone is pounding a drum. Not for music, for rhythm. Two women step forward, eyes locked. They're about to settle a dispute with a verse match. Yes, this is a real thing. When words caused offense, words could settle it. The rules, alternate verses, insults must rhyme. No repeating imagery, no food references unless metaphorical. The first woman starts strong. Your sheep are thin, your soup is weak, your husband dreams of someone meek. Oof. The second woman narrows her eyes. You wear your cloak like stolen thread. Your children cry. Your goats drop dead. The crowd gasps. One goat actually does faint, possibly unrelated. After 3 rounds, a judge declares the second woman the victor. The first must deliver a public compliment at sunrise. Legal? Technically, yes. The dispute over a shared spring and 2 confused ducks is resolved. You learn that during feasts, it wasn't uncommon for land disputes, inheritance issues, and marriage claims to begin with a toast. One man might raise a horn and declare, I drink to my bride to be, daughter of Askir. Someone would blink and say, Askir doesn't have a daughter. And suddenly, the feast turns into a hearing. There were rules to prevent this. Not many, but enough. For example, you couldn't claim ownership of land during the 3rd round of drinking. First and second rounds were fine. Third, too drunk, too rowdy, too likely to escalate into swordplay. That's the law. It's in the verse. You think back to modern parties, awkward toasts, overconfident karaoke. Here, every word, every toast, every drunken proclamation might follow you into the next morning with a legal summons. Talk about hangovers with consequences. You sit near a group of elders debating whether a recent boast was legally binding. One says yes, it was poetic, public, and confident. Another disagrees. It lacked metaphor. Apparently, metaphors are necessary for some legal boasts to carry weight. You file that under weird but believable Viking logic. Then there's the time a man tried to undo a boast by composing a counter poem in which he claimed he was possessed by a drunk spirit. The poem was good, very good. The council forgave him, but also fined him 2 goats for lyrical dishonesty. The night deepens, the boasting slows, the air grows thick with sleepiness and stew. Someone sings a lullaby that used to be a threat. You lean back against a log, eyes half closed, as the feast winds down. You hear a final boast, this one soft, almost whispered. An old man murmurs, I once loved someone so deeply I forgot my own name. No one challenges it. No one laughs. It drifts into the stars. And you think, sometimes the boldest boasts aren't about land or sheep or battle. They're about memory, loss, love. And those are the ones nobody disputes. The morning breaks slowly, gray light creeping across the landscape like it's testing the temperature before committing. You rise stiffly, brushing bits of moss from your cloak, and stretch. There's a murmur through the crowd, a different tone from yesterday's shouts and poetic brawls. Today's talk is sharper, more careful, because today's topic, women and the law. Now you might expect the Viking world to be entirely a man's game. Axes, oaths, and beard-based authority. But you'd be only half right. Viking women had more legal standing than many of their medieval counterparts across Europe. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, and attend the thing under certain conditions. One woman nearby sums it up with a dry smile. You didn't need a beard to own a farm, just a spine. You trail a group of women heading to a side gathering, not an official thing circle, but a space where disputes involving marriages, dowries, and inheritance are discussed. sometimes before they explode into larger legal battles. This informal system is part of what keeps peace and sometimes holds more practical sway than the grand speeches of the main ring. You sit quietly and watch as a middle-aged woman steps forward. Her issue, her late husband's brother, has been trying to claim her land, arguing that a widow's right only holds for one winter. She responds with something sharper than an axe, a legal verse. She quotes a law that says a woman may remain in control of her husband's property if she manages the harvest and feeds at least 3 workers. She has, and she's ready to name them. The gathering murmurs approval. The brother pales slightly. He doesn't argue. Sometimes the law is clear. Sometimes it just sounds better when sung with conviction. Historians still argue how widespread this kind of agency really was. While sagas and some law codes show women as active participants in the legal world, the degree varied by region, wealth, and circumstance. Still, the evidence is there. Women weren't just background characters. They were plaintiffs, witnesses, landholders, and on occasion, fierce legal strategists. You overhear a case involving a divorce. Yes, divorce. Viking women could initiate it. All you had to do was declare it in front of witnesses, often at your marriage bed's foot, and return your spouse's property, except the part legally yours, of course. Today's case involves a woman accusing her husband of gross stew negligence and habitual poor singing. Everyone laughs, but the real reason is property. She wants her own dowry back, plus the goats her uncle gave as a wedding gift. The thing hears the argument, including a spirited list of the husband's failings, some of which involve suspicious bread storage, and grants her request. The marriage is dissolved. She leaves with her goats and a quiet dignity. He stays behind with a ladle and some hard thinking to do. Another woman presents a more serious complaint. She's accusing a local merchant of coercion and theft. She says he took goods under false pretenses and pressured her into signing an agreement she didn't understand. The elders lean in. This is no small matter. A female merchant listening nearby steps in to support her claim, presenting a poem that outlines fair trade expectations, a kind of lyrical contract template. The council reviews the case. The merchant is found at fault. He must repay her twice the value of the stolen goods and apologize publicly in verse. He groans. The crowd waits. His poem is clunky, awkward, and includes the line, "I was greedy, yes, indeedy," which earns groans from everyone, but he finishes it. That's enough. You're struck by how structured this all is. There's no illusion of full equality, of course. Certain crimes, especially those involving honor or violence, still slant toward the male perspective. But Viking law acknowledges women. It makes space for them. And sometimes that space is enough for real power. One saga tells of Un the Deep-Minded, a widow who led her entire family from Norway to Iceland, claimed land, built a settlement, and ruled it wisely. At her funeral, it was said she was buried in a ship, standing upright, a mark of reverence usually reserved for warriors. Legal power didn't always wear armor. You pass a young girl watching attentively, lips moving as she repeats bits of legal verse under her breath. She's learning, already practicing. You wonder what kind of justice she'll speak into the world one day. Someone mentions that women sometimes acted as peace weavers, mediating between families, crafting settlements in the form of dowries or land arrangements. This wasn't a soft role, it was strategic, high stakes diplomacy in a society where one bad insult could lead to years of feuding. You also learn about inheritance traps, clauses slipped into wills and verbal contracts that favored sons or male cousins. Some women fought these with poetry, others used clever loopholes, like gifting their land to a trusted ally with an agreement to gift it back after a safe interval. Viking legal culture didn't always reward the bold, but it respected the clever. There's a story about a woman who faked madness to avoid a forced marriage, then later sued the man who tried to claim her as his caretaker. She won and made him wear a fool's belt to the next three things. By now, the sun has climbed just enough to warm your shoulders. The circle disbands for stew. Conversations trail off into gossip and laughter. You catch one woman teaching another how to compose a verse complaint about someone's bad mead. It includes the phrase, tongue like moldy seal fat. Ouch. You rise, legs a little stiff, but mind spinning. In this world, law isn't locked behind scrolls. It's spoken, shaped, lived, and women, for all their obstacles, are part of that living system. And you suspect that as long as there's rhyme, memory, and a good stew, they always will be. A gust of wind kicks up as you wander beyond the main gathering ring, past a small knot of people arguing over the price of fish stew, and into a quieter space at the edge of the thing site. The chatter fades, replaced by whispers and sideways glances. You're in troll country now, legally speaking. Yes, trolls. You notice a carved post, weathered but unmistakable, a runic warning against crossing a particular ridge after dark, lest the mountain dwellers take offense. You're not entirely sure what that means, but someone nearby mutters, "Don't laugh. My cousin lost 3 sheep and a sense of direction up there." Here's the curious part. Viking law didn't just deal with people. It included clauses for dealing with supernatural entities, land spirits, elves, trolls, wights, and things no one liked to name too loudly. And these weren't just stories told to scare kids or sell amulets at the market. They were codified concerns. You ask an elder if that's true, and he nods gravely. You build a farm, he says. You make peace with the land wights first. Don't, and your roof leaks blood. That sounds excessive. But you notice that almost every farmstead you've seen in this land has a small pile of stones or a carved wooden figure at its border. Offerings, not decorative, legal precaution. Some sagas mention laws against building on known haunted ground without proper offerings. In one case, a man ignored the warnings, built a barn on a cursed hillside, and was subsequently sued, not by the spirits, but by his neighbors, for knowingly inviting ghostly interference. He had to pay damages after everyone's hay turned sour, and a pig started screaming at midnight. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuine beliefs or social tools. Maybe they gave people language to talk about the unexplained, storms, illness, disappearing livestock. Or maybe they really believed their neighbors had elf problems. You pass another post, this one bearing a crude drawing of a very wide-eyed goat. A woman nearby explains it's a marker for troll watchers. She says her great-aunt served as one for 2 winters, responsible for observing the hills at dusk and reporting anything strange. In return, she got stew privileges and 1/3 of any recovered livestock. Troll laws varied by region. In Iceland, there were rules about building near caves. In Norway, you weren't supposed to throw wastewater toward the northern winds in case you angered invisible neighbors. In Greenland, people left carved fish bones by their door to ward off jealous spirits. It wasn't superstition, it was risk management. You hear about one particularly odd case. A man claimed that his cart was overturned by a troll while traveling a mountain path. When he brought the complaint to the thing, people laughed until he showed them the smashed axle and odd tracks in the snow. The ruling? No compensation, but the route was declared questionable. A warning was posted and travelers rerouted. The precedent was known as Halfgrim's Rule, named after the man, and was later used to shut down an entire fjord path during heavy fog after someone heard whispering trees. True story, allegedly. Of course, people could, and did, abuse these rules. Claiming spirit interference became a convenient excuse for lost goods, poor planning, or suspicious sheep deaths. One merchant tried to skip a debt by saying the spirits moved his silver to another realm. The law speaker fined him twice the original amount and ordered him to sleep alone in the barn for a week to await their return. Children learned early not to joke about these matters in court. One law poem warns, "Mock the mist and lose your cow. Laugh at stone and break your plow." It rhymes better in Old Norse, probably. You hear of a unique compromise clause. If someone disturbed a spirit site unknowingly, they could be spared legal trouble by performing a ritual apology, usually involving bread, ale, and a verse of humility. One man's apology song became so popular it was later adapted into a lullaby. Yes, somewhere out there, babies are rocked to sleep by a tune originally written to appease angry hill trolls. Some trolls, by the way, had property rights. In one obscure tale, a family sued another for cutting trees on troll-protected land. The land had been marked with rune stones decades prior, and while no one had seen a troll recently, everyone agreed it was better to pay the fine than find their chimney stuffed with seaweed. You ask a skald if he believes in trolls. He grins, taps his temple, and says, "Not in here, but the law does, and the law doesn't care if you believe. It only cares if the hay catches fire." There's a theory among modern scholars that these rules served a dual purpose: protecting sacred spaces and maintaining psychological order. Forests, caves, foggy ridges, these were places of danger. By framing them as troll-haunted, the law created a reason to be cautious. Respect the land. Don't wander drunk into the mist. Leave offerings, not footprints. You return to the edge of the gathering, passing a small altar stacked with stones and bones. A young woman kneels, leaves a fish head, and whispers a verse. She looks up and shrugs. "Can't hurt," she says. You nod. In this world, legal protection isn't just about people. It's about unseen forces, shared beliefs, and the understanding that sometimes Not all justice is human, and as the wind shifts, carrying with it a low groan from the hills, you decide, just for tonight, not to walk near the caves, just in case. Snowflakes start drifting from the sky, light at first, then thick enough to make the world go soft at the edges. You rub your hands together and pull your cloak tighter as you realize something quietly astonishing. The thing is still happening. Viking justice doesn't hibernate. Even in winter, when the ground turns to stone and every breath becomes a small cloud, people gather. Maybe not as often, maybe not with full song and ceremony, but disputes don't wait for spring. And so, here you are, watching a group of very bundled humans argue about cow paths while their beards frost over. You've arrived at the seasonal thing, a trimmed down version of the grand assembly held in the darker months. Less pageantry, more stew. Cases are shorter, disputes are simpler, and most of the judgment revolves around things that can't be ignored: food stores, injuries, and the pressing need for shelter. The dispute currently unfolding involves a collapsed storage shed and some very soggy grain. One man claims his neighbor built too close to the stream. The neighbor says the stream moved. The law speaker, swaddled in fur and halfway through a mug of something steaming, raises a gloved hand and quotes a line from a winter verse: "Snow changes truth, but never stone." In other words, property lines don't care about runoff. Decision. Neighbor pays compensation in smoked meat. Grain man nods, satisfied. Justice moves on. Winter. Things weren't held everywhere. In the more remote or storm-prone regions, assemblies paused entirely until the thaw. But in Iceland, for example, smaller local courts, called vetrarthing or winter things, would gather in turf halls or sheltered enclosures. Business still happened. Laws were still recited, albeit with fewer dramatic poems and more teeth chattering. Historians still argue whether these seasonal things held the same authority as their sunnier counterparts. Some sources suggest rulings made in winter could be appealed later. Others say, no, the decision stood, unless, of course, the judge was drunk on glog, in which case it could be reviewed upon clarity. You follow a group trudging toward one of the makeshift shelters. Inside, a few oil lamps flicker, casting a cozy but slightly eerie glow over the proceedings. Two women are seated across from each other, discussing a dispute over hay bales, specifically whose oxen ate whose supply. It's a classic cold season problem: hungry animals, snow-covered boundaries, and vague hoofprints. Evidence is sparse, as always. One woman presents a chunk of dung and a poem about the way her ox snorts in guilt. It's not legally binding, but the law speaker nods solemnly and admits that her verses bear a weight of implication. The ox in question snorts from outside. Nearby, a younger man tries to settle a debt. He owes dried fish, but only has frozen onions. The other party sighs, negotiates, and they settle on an exchange rate of 3 bulbs per tail. You write that down. It might come in handy. Seasonal law is flexible law. Viking legal culture understood that winter changed things: resources, travel, even tempers. Snowstorms delayed trials. Blizzards could be used as legal excuses, but only once per season. You couldn't just claim storm interference every time you forgot to show up. One saga tells of a man who tried it 3 times. On the third, he was made to shovel the entire meeting circle bare before speaking, a punishment known as storm duty. You catch part of another hearing involving a broken sled and a missing reindeer. Reindeer aren't common, but this one had wandered south from the Sami lands. The accused claims it ran itself into the sea. The owner responds with a carved charm he found in the man's house, which he claims proves reindeer theft. A heated debate ensues over whether the charm is decorative or evidence. The sled, meanwhile, is presented in court as a witness. Someone bangs on it for emphasis. Eventually, they settle on a fine of 4 woolen mittens and a promise not to harbor exotic livestock without a permit. You have no idea if that's a real law or just winter logic. Either way, both parties leave smiling. The sled stays behind. Outside, the snow is heavier now. Still, a small crowd gathers to hear the seasonal recitation of land rights. It's tradition, even if half the land is currently buried. The law speaker clears his throat, voice slightly muffled by his scarf, and begins, "From the rock shaped like a sleeping goat to the ash that sings in wind, this land belongs to," and so on. It might seem strange. Speaking of borders you can't see, enforcing rules that only exist beneath feet of snow. But here, memory holds everything. Law isn't always about what's visible, it's about what's remembered, and that includes promises made last summer, debts frozen until thaw, and boundary stones marked by stories rather than sight. One woman tells you her family's fence line is remembered by a winter tale, from the pine where the raven nested, down to the stone where mother fell and swore. You ask if that's in the legal records. She laughs. It's better than records. It rhymes. The seasonal thing winds down. A small pot of glog is passed around, hot, spiced, and possibly flammable. People sip, talk, stretch their backs. There are no feasts this time, just shared stew, warm cloaks, and the satisfaction of resolving just enough to survive another month. You pull your hood tighter and exhale. The law doesn't sleep. It just gets frostbite. And as the sun sets at the absurdly early hour of 3 o'clock, someone taps a stone 3 times with a bone spoon. Session closed. The wind whips sharp now, carrying the smell of smoke and onions and something fermented that you're trying not to identify. You stumble into a ring of tents where the real chaos begins, not the solemn, fur-wrapped order of daytime hearings, but the unfiltered, ale-soaked courtroom of the night. Welcome to drunken justice. You arrive just in time to see a man declare, far too loudly, "I hereby claim that rock as my cousin's beard." This makes no sense, of course, but everyone laughs, and someone, probably his actual cousin, responds, "Then I demand 3 goats and a full apology in the form of interpretive dance." It's funny until it's not. Because in Viking culture, drunk words weren't just drunk words. They could stick, especially if they were spoken at a thing, in front of witnesses, and met with no challenge. You settle by the fire, as 2 elders try to mediate a drunken contract made just last night. Apparently, a fisherman bet his boat on whether he could eat a boiled turnip without blinking. He succeeded, barely, But now the loser wants his boat back. He claims it was a metaphorical wager. The other man insists it was spiritually binding. The law speaker, roused from his tent with a groan and a very stern blanket, rules. If the wager was witnessed and the terms were clear, the boat changes hands. He glances at the witnesses. They all nod, solemn and extremely hungover. So, yes, drunken justice counts, unless the community decides to intervene. There's a phrase for that: waking revision. If a decision made under the influence causes too much trouble, elders can convene a morning council and essentially undo it, but only if no one involved has already written a song about it. Because once a story is sung, it's part of the oral record. You watch as a woman tries to reverse a bet she made at midnight, offering her prize chicken in exchange for a man's cloak. The cloak, she now realizes, is infested with something unholy. But he's already written 2 verses about the exchange and performed them to great applause. The council shrugs. Decision stands. Chicken's gone. So is the man, vanished into the fog with a smug grin and a lice problem. Historians still argue whether drunken decisions were binding because of belief in fate, or simply because it was easier than untangling all the late-night nonsense. One theory is that Viking law respected conviction above clarity. If you were passionate enough to swear something, even drunk, that meant it held truth. You hear another tale: 2 brothers arguing over a cow. At sunset, they reach an impasse, but by moonlight and mead, they agree to race for it, barefoot through snow, with pine cones tied to their belts. It sounds ridiculous. It was. One sprained his ankle, the other fell in a river. But the cow was awarded to the one who recited a poem about the ordeal that made everyone laugh and cringe. That's Viking compromise. Of course, not all drunk decisions ended well. There are stories of feasts that turned into brawls, oaths sworn in jest, and marriages accidentally arranged. One woman tells you her cousin once woke up legally married to a man she'd only complimented for his cheese making. He took the praise as a proposal. The law agreed. It took 3 sheep and a song of regret to untangle it. There were safeguards. For instance, if an oath was made while holding a horn upside down, it could be challenged as symbolically inverted. Also, certain phrases, like "May Odin laugh at me if I lie," carried different weights depending on your sobriety. If your breath smelled like glog, the council might wave it off, but only once. Then there's the tradition of the morning regret table. Some communities had a designated hour after sunrise where any claim made during the night could be revisited, but only if you were willing to sit on the shame log. Yes, a literal log, cold, wet, visible to all. You had to sit there, explain what you said, and why it was a bad idea. The community would vote whether to release you from your words or memorialize them in verse. You see a man shuffling toward the log now. He mutters something about offering his cart in exchange for a really good joke. It wasn't that good. He sits. The vote begins. Spoiler, he doesn't get the cart back. But here's the thing. This system isn't cruel. It's deeply human. It accepts that people make mistakes, especially when the ale flows and the fires are warm. But it also understands that society needs stories, and if your mistake becomes a part of one, you own it. You pass a tent where 2 women are composing a new drinking song. It begins with, "Oh, I loved you more than salted cod, and you stole my boots while I still nodded." It's catchy. It'll probably end up in court next week. Someone offers you a horn of ale. You politely decline, not because you're above it, but because you're already drafting your own verses in your head, and frankly, you don't trust yourself not to start a minor war over metaphor. As dawn edges into the sky, the drunken justice fades into memory. Some rulings will stand, others will be softened, rewritten, or quietly forgotten. But the songs, they'll be sung again at weddings, at funerals, around fires just like this one. And next time someone makes a bold, foolish declaration with ale on their breath and too many eyes watching, you'll know that might be the moment a new law is born, or at least a very inconvenient poem. The camp stirs again, this time with less shouting and fewer hangovers. You wander toward a clearing where a curious scene unfolds. Two men facing each other, one holding a wooden staff, the other, wait, is that a stone covered in runes? Yes, yes it is. Welcome to the Viking version of presenting evidence. In this world, evidence is a performance. You don't just show up with a broken fence or a bruised arm. You bring objects of meaning, things with story weight, like a carved runestone, a goat's tooth, or, famously, a herring that still has the look of betrayal in its dead little eyes. You can't make this up. Actually, someone did, about 900 years ago. The man with the runestone is claiming land inheritance. The stone, about the size of a shoebox and covered in painstaking scratches, supposedly proves that his uncle left him the field by the marsh. He lifts it up for the assembly to see, turns it in his hands, and begins to recite it. Yes, read it? Not exactly. These aren't letters, not in the way you think. Viking runes were symbols, often poetic, sometimes vague. Interpreting them takes skill, and let's be honest, a little dramatic flair. He finishes the chant with, "So declared in shadow and storm, this land flows to me like melt from the moor." Solid ending. But now it's the other guy's turn. He steps forward, calmly, and holds up a bundle of goat bones. Everyone leans in. Apparently, these are ritual bones, burned and marked in a rite meant to reveal falsehood. He claims he performed the ritual after his cousin made the inheritance claim, and that the bones cracked in a way that indicates liar's breath. A laugh from the crowd, but not dismissal. Rituals matter, so does symbolism. He begins to shake the bones in a small wooden bowl, humming under his breath. It's half theater, half testimony. The law speaker watches closely. Historians still argue over how seriously these forms of evidence were taken. Some say it was all just a show, a social mechanism to let people feel like something was proven. Others argue that symbolic items carried real legal weight, especially if backed by memory and verse. Either way, in a society where writing is rare and paper is expensive, objects speak. You move through the crowd, listening to other disputes. A woman presents a cloak with a missing corner, proof, she claims, that her neighbor's dog attacked her during a fence dispute. The neighbor denies owning a dog. She counters with a scrap of dog fur tied into a knot, an old charm used to trap the truth. A witness sniffs it and nods. "Smells like wolf," he says. Another woman presents a braid of hair, human, dyed with ash. She says it came from a rival who cursed her turnip patch. Her evidence? The hair was found in the turnip stew, and the stew made her goats sleepy. The law speaker considers this, then asks if she brought the goats. She has. They're dozing nearby. The case is adjourned for stew examination. You're beginning to see how Viking justice is part courtroom, part shrine. Every item is charged with memory and meaning. A broken comb might represent an oath. A shard of pottery could be a silent accusation. A cracked drinking horn, a promise betrayed. Sometimes, objects don't work alone. They must be accompanied by a saga. You hear about a man who tried to reclaim his father's axe by presenting the axe itself, plus a recitation of the family's forging story, a multiverse poem involving a cursed deer, 3 storms, and an anvil that sang. It worked. The axe was returned, though not before everyone begged him to shorten the poem next time. There were also witness items. These were objects held or touched during a key event, like a piece of wood from a door used during a marriage ceremony, or a stone sat on during an oath. If you brought that item back later, it could testify on your behalf. Not literally, of course, but in the symbolic way that counted here. One saga tells of a man who wore the same boots during every trade negotiation. When accused of dishonesty, he presented the boots in court, claiming they walk only with truth. The jury of elders laughed, but also let him off with a warning, probably because he rhymed boots with truth, which, while technically inaccurate, was deeply persuasive. Then there's dream evidence, risky but not unheard of. If you had a vivid dream involving the accused, you could present it, provided you could tell it in verse. One young girl once dreamed of her uncle stealing bread and claimed the dream revealed a hidden stash under his bed. When they checked, lo and behold, 3 moldy loaves. Dream validated. She was awarded a ceremonial honey cake and a week of not doing chores. You watch a man now produce a string of fish bones tied into a charm. He says it caught the words of a neighbor cursing his name during a moonlit boat ride. The accused, annoyed, counters with a shield that supposedly deflects lies. The law speaker pauses, then says, "Let the shield lie with the charm overnight. If it shatters, we revisit." Case pending. Modern legal systems have evidence rooms. Vikings had storytelling circles and charm pouches, and yes, sometimes those items were manipulated, stones recarved, bones borrowed, verses tweaked. But often, it wasn't about proof in the modern sense. It was about narrative believability. If your object fit the story, if it made the crowd nod, if the rhythm worked, if the goat didn't faint, it held power. You walk back toward the firelight, past bundles of herbs, a jar of suspicious feathers, and one man clutching a doll carved to look like a specific neighbor. You don't ask, he doesn't explain. Because here, evidence speaks, but only if you know how to listen. By now, the thing feels like its own small world. You've met the farmers, the law speakers, the boastful, the poetic, and even the folks who barter with fish bones. But now, a new group has arrived. Strangers, dressed just slightly differently, with accents that stretch vowels in ways you don't recognize. They're foreigners, traders, travelers, and wanderers from far-flung shores. And Viking law, as you quickly learn, had a whole set of rules just for them. You approach the edge of the market square, where two men are locked in a lively argument. One is a local chieftain's nephew. The other wears a fur hat that screams "not from here." They're arguing over the price of a woven cloak, but beneath it lies a larger issue: how Viking society handled outsiders. It's not as simple as us versus them. Norse culture was complex, surprisingly networked, and, thanks to its far-reaching trade routes, full of foreign interaction. From Arabic merchants in Hedeby to Irish monks turned diplomatic guests, outsiders weren't rare. But Viking law didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. There were tariffs, host expectations, and yes, immediate fines if certain rituals weren't observed. One of the first? Guessed right. If a foreigner entered a village without first declaring their intent at the longhouse or offering a gift, they could be fined, or worse, treated as hostile. You hear about a man from Frisia who walked in, declined to offer a goat, and ended up being accidentally ignored for 3 weeks. That's Viking passive aggression. Historians still debate whether these restrictions were protectionist or just polite paranoia, probably both. Foreigners had to walk a tightrope, respectful but assertive, generous but not showy. A little too much gold, and you might be taxed into oblivion. Too little, and people might suspect you of witchcraft. One man tried to pay with a coin stamped with a foreign king's face. It was melted down immediately for safety. You watch as another foreigner, a woman from the East by the look of her dress, presents a dispute to the thing. She claims a local cheated her in a trade. 2 barrels of salt that turned out to be full of gravel. The man snorts. "Salt of the earth," he says. The law speaker is not amused. The challenge here? She's not familiar with local law poems. She can't recite the appropriate verse and has no kin to speak on her behalf. But she has something else: an interpreter and a carefully written letter from a neighboring chieftain vouching for her honesty. She hands it over. Written law, rare, exotic, and slightly suspicious in this world. The law speaker accepts it with a squint, then calls a small council to decipher it. Half an hour later, they rule in her favor. Gravelman is fined 3 cloaks and must carry the barrels to her cart himself. So it's not that the system excludes foreigners, it just makes them work for legitimacy. You hear of another case where a foreign ship was fined simply for anchoring in the wrong cove. The law required visiting vessels to dock in designated stranger waters, partly for safety, partly to keep the community from being surprised at dawn by a random merchant yelling about silk. Viking law even had protocols for temporary citizens. If a foreigner stayed long enough, married a local, or converted to the local belief system, they could petition for partial rights. These included the ability to speak at a thing, own land, and complain about stew quality without being ignored. One saga tells of a Saxon who won over an entire village by teaching them how to brew beer that didn't taste like sadness. Within a year, he was running the local alehouse, quoting law poems with a terrible accent, and suing his neighbor over a singing goose. Truly the dream. You also learn about foreign fines, penalties higher than usual when the wronged party was an outsider. This wasn't out of generosity, it was insurance. If a local cheated a visitor, the fine wasn't just restitution, it was a community wide PR campaign. Look, we're not savages. We even made Gorm pay double for that moldy cheese. There were also hospitality inspectors. Okay, maybe not by that name, but certain elders kept track of which households welcomed visitors fairly. Households that failed too many guest right challenges could lose prestige, or worse, be barred from trading privileges. And yes, stew came into play again. One elderly woman tells you she once judged a guest right dispute based entirely on the seasoning. Too much garlic, she says, means you didn't mean it. Not all encounters ended well. One foreign merchant tried to bribe a thing leader with foreign perfumes and silk. The gift was accepted, but then the man was fined for assuming judgment could be bought. The leader wore the silk for the rest of the week. It's not hypocrisy, he said. It's evidence. Foreign women faced a different kind of scrutiny. They were often admired for their exotic clothes, language, or crafts, but also treated as potential spies or witches if they appeared too clever. You hear a tale of a woman who was accused of hexing a chieftain's stew, only to be cleared when she revealed it was just saffron. He apologized with a poem titled Regret in Yellow. Modern scholars might call all this proto-international law, but here it's just life. You come from far away. You pay extra attention. You bring gifts. You listen. And ideally, you learn which stew ingredient is too fancy. You watch the visiting traders begin to pack up their goods: beads, cloth, salted fish wrapped in wax. They speak in low tones, but a few laugh. One slaps a local on the back and recites a newly learned insult, badly. Everyone cheers. The day winds down. Foreigners leave. Locals watch them go, murmuring final thoughts. That one knew her fish. The tall one forgot the goat. Shame about the perfume. And you realize Viking law isn't just about rules, it's about rhythm. Step wrong, and the whole village hears it. But step carefully, with story and stew, and you just might dance your way into the chorus. The fires burn lower now, their light casting long shadows across the field that has held so much shouting, verse, and drama. The sheep are finally quiet. Someone is snoring into a pile of straw. And you, still wrapped in your cloak, settle in for one last tale, the slow winding down of Viking law as the world knew it. Because even the most lyrical, sheep-based legal system must one day give way. You overhear a pair of elders talking about the last thing, not as in the final meeting ever, but as in the last time it still felt old. Before Christianity swept through, before foreign kings started sending clerks with parchment and ink, before silence replaced recitation. The Viking Age was never officially declared over, but for the law, the turning point was gradual, an erosion of oral tradition, nudged by missionaries, monarchs, and market towns. The old law speakers began writing things down, slowly, hesitantly, like people recording the fading tune of a song they used to sing without thinking. It started with conversions. Christianity brought more than just new gods. It brought Latin, bishops, scribes, and the idea that divine law didn't need to rhyme. The new laws were imported from the continent, written, sealed, unpoetic. Gone were the saga-steeped judgments about goats. In came rules about tithes, marriage oaths, and proper burial techniques that didn't involve mounds and burning boats. Historians still argue whether this change was peaceful or imposed. Some say it was embraced, a relief from the chaos of interpretive verse trials. Others mourn the loss of community-led justice, of the law that sang your name, judged your sheep, and made your apology a performance. You hear about the Althing of Iceland, the oldest surviving parliament in the world, which was eventually absorbed into Norwegian law, then Danish rule. It still exists today, but now with microphones and suits instead of tunics and glog. And yet, the old ways echo. In some parts, people still recite snatches of legal verse at weddings or funerals. Some farmers still place a carved stone near the barn to mark a truth line. The custom of settling disputes over stew, alive and well, though now it's more about who brings the best bread. The thing sites remain, windswept, grassy, often marked only by stones. But when you walk through them, you can almost hear it. The chant of the law speaker, the rhythmic thump of goat hooves, the laughter as someone tries to rhyme fence with consequence, badly. You see it even in modern Scandinavian justice, a system obsessed with fairness, transparency, and not raising your voice. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's the residue of a culture that believed justice should be public, performed, and poetic. You talk to an old woman who still teaches her grandchildren how to argue in verse, not because they'll need it in court, but because she says words stick better when they dance. And maybe that's the heart of it. Viking law wasn't just rules, it was ritual, something shared, lived, recited, a story that kept the village from falling apart, a song that settled the dust after battle, a sheep bleat echoing into eternity. As the camp empties and the fires die down, you find yourself whispering a verse from earlier. Let no fence fall from forgetfulness. Let no oath rot in silence. You don't know if it's real or something you made up from the rhythm of it all. Doesn't matter. It feels right. Because in the end, Viking law didn't die. It just changed its clothes. Traded cloaks for robes, staves for pens. The poetry faded, but the memory lingers. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, you realize you've become part of the tradition. You listened, you remembered, you walked the thing's circle and lived to tell about it. Not everyone can say that. So rest now, traveler. Let the sheep lie still, let the verses sleep. Justice for now is done, and now, as the embers settle and the last verses float into the hush, let your breath slow, let your mind loosen its grip. Picture the wide fields emptying under pale starlight. The voices are gone, the disputes resolved, some just for now, others perhaps forever. Snow begins to fall in finer flakes, catching on the mossy stones where people once gathered in heated circles. The scent of smoke lingers, gentle now, no longer sharp. The goat trails have faded into soft indentations. The law speaker has wrapped his cloak tight and gone silent. The rune stones sit untouched, their messages known to the wind alone. Nothing needs settling tonight. The quarrels can wait. The goats are sleeping. Even the stew pots are quiet. You breathe in slowly. out again, longer. The rhythm of this place, of verse and snow and gentle silence, wraps itself around you like wool. Your heartbeat eases into that same tempo. You are no longer a witness, nor a traveler, nor even a speaker. You are part of the hush, the stillness, the pause between verse and verdict. No more boasting, no more fines, no more awkward fish-based metaphors. Only sleep now, deep, ancient, earned, like the sleep of the land when the snow covers even the stones that once marked the edge of someone's honor. So let go, drift off, let the old stories hold you. You've done enough.